I want to welcome you all. Thank you for taking the time to participate with us today. And as many of you know, today is World Refugee Day. And what a better day to celebrate the programming that Cuso International is doing. My name is Tina Sweeney, and I am the Outreach and Partnerships Officer here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I'd like to get right into it and introduce our panelists to you. I'm pleased to introduce Ebrima Sonko. Ebrima is a Gambia sociologist who's been working in development for 30 years. He has worked with several international organizations, including the United Nations World Food Program, and is currently the country representative for Cuso International in Nigeria. Ebrima, if you can say hello so everyone can see you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome.
Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce Emeric Astre. Emeric has 8 years of experience in the implementation of large-scale international cooperation projects in both Europe and Latin America. He has over 5 years of experience in Colombia and 3 in Brussels, working with the European Union affairs. It's great to have Emeric working with us in Colombia on the SCOPE project, and he's been doing it for the past 2 years. As a learning organization, Cuso understands the influence that knowledge sharing can have, and we're here today to talk about immigration, the courage and the resilience that it takes, and how we are standing in solidarity with refugees and migrants. We're only as strong as the partners with whom we work, and I would like to thank them for their efforts. I would like to thank the efforts of our volunteers, our generous donors, and Global Affairs Canada for standing alongside Cuso and advancing our mission. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation as something comes up in your mind. Just type it into the Q&A box, and I'll make sure that I leave time at the end to then forward your questions to the correct panelists. The UN Migration Agency has declared that today more people than ever live in a country other than the one in which they were born. The number of international migrants has soared to 244 million this year, and that is an increase of more than 40% since the year 2000. And while many individuals we know migrate out of choice, many others migrate out of necessity. Currently, Cuso is overseeing 2 new projects. One is called Building Skills for Livelihood Enhancement in Refugee Building Communities in Cross River and Benue States. That project is in partnership with the UNHCR, which is operating out of Nigeria. And UNHCR stands for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. That program is offering skills for refugees, skills building, improved skills, and for host community members as well. The second project that you're going to hear about today is called the New Vulnerable Population Economic Integration of Venezuelan Migrants in Colombia. And they are also offering employment training to Venezuelan migrants and returned Colombians. But let's start with Ebrima. I understand, Ebrima, that the program supporting refugees and holding communities is built off the learning of ULEAD, and that program stands for Youth Leadership, Entrepreneurship, Access, and Development Project. Can you please tell us a little bit about the ULEAD project and what it has achieved?
Oh, thank you very much, Tina. The ULEAD is a project that has been funded by Canada, the government of Canada, through Global Affairs Canada. And it essentially responds to 2 key issues. When we came to Cross River, we did a little bit of scoping, and we found that 2 issues were very important that need to be addressed. The first is the high unemployment rate, particularly for the youth, which was higher than the national average of about 27. In Cross River, you have up to 35% unemployment rate. Now, the second is Cross River happens to have a lot of advantage in terms of the environment. Now, Cross River has the largest forest cover in the whole of Nigeria. Its climate is excellent, and yet it is not exploited well, even though they don't have oil. So we thought there was a lot of potential in that. So together what we did was trying to address with this ULEAD project the high unemployment rate, and creating opportunities for youth within the natural resource sector so that they can deal with issues around agriculture, aquaculture, and the forestry, and make a living out of it. So that was the main thrust of it. Now, essentially, it builds skills for young people so that they can harness those opportunities. And it has a very strong focus on environment and gender. Gender, because these are the excluded components within the societies, but also this environment that is of so much importance to everybody. Now, we try to address, first of all, the issues by training, providing entrepreneurship training to the youth. Now, our target had been 12,000 youth to be trained. Now, the focus of the training is only to change their mindset, to understand that they can become entrepreneurs. There are opportunities around them and they can take care of that. So we have achieved 11,000 at this point out of the 12,000. And then we provide them technical training. Essentially, whatever area they want to operate in, the value chains, we provide them a training in that. And 4,000 of them have been provided a training within the sectors that they wanted to start their businesses on. And then they are linked to financial institutions. So essentially, 3,500 new businesses were created, and the 600 existing businesses were also supported to move to the next level. And we do a lot of policy work, and that's done at the level of the State Planning Commission so that they can trigger down to the ministries and the departments to ensure that environment is really mainstreamed and into the budgets, into the programs, and so forth. Now, we also try to support employment, youth employment, to address youth unemployment. So essentially, we provide training for the youths to improve their employability. We provide them computer centers for them to learn computer, to access information and to operate. And like that, about 2,000 jobs have been created. And the project is actually done in a broad partnership, including government, volunteers, national partners, implementing partners, and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe you can share a little story of Etan?
Etam exactly is a school leaver who has been out of job for something like 12 years. He has never, in fact, had a job. So when he heard about the ULEAD, he came around. And unfortunately for him again, after he did the training, he was not able to get the grant. So Etam decided to continue on his life by trying to be a laborer. So he, despite a university graduate, he became a laborer and he saved his money and then he started his business. And now he has 3 fish ponds and he has employed about 4 people. So this is really a very good story. But I'm more intrigued actually about all my youths that we train, how industrious and creative they have been. Now, 80% of them have not actually received any loans. These are small businesses, and they tried out of their savings, out of their family connections to start their own businesses, not sitting down waiting for their turn for a grant to come. Many of them we are also trying to connect to be on their own with the microfinance banks. So they're doing quite well by themselves, even if the project withdraws.
Thank you. Thank you, Ebrima, for explaining kind of ULEAD and how job creation programs can impact young people in Nigeria. So the impact of the Cameroonian crisis, just shifting a little bit, has reached what is being called unprecedented scale. Some 32,000 refugees have been registered in Cross River, Benue, Taraba, Akwa Ibom states. And so, Ebrima, can you give us a little bit of background and context on the Building Skills for Livelihood Enhancement, this new refugee holding community project in partnership with UNHCR, and how it builds off of the learnings of the ULEAD project?
So, as you rightly said, this project actually or rather the refugee situation now is serious. It has in fact reached 32,000 at this point. And it's a situation that calls for more concerted efforts. Now, but going back a little bit to the history, why this situation is out. Cameroon is like Canada in that they are both bilingual. Cameroon has an English-speaking and a French-speaking section, two sections. And essentially, back in history, Cameroon, part of the English side had been ruled from Nigeria. And what that means is Nigeria and Cameroon have a common coexistence within the border areas. Especially, you will recall there is a small peninsula there that they call the Bakassi Peninsula, which had in fact recently been of dispute between the two countries. So essentially, when something happened back in Cameroon, people easily move in here. Now the French feel, the English section feels it's a little bit marginalized, and therefore they are agitating for more autonomy, and that creates the crisis here and there. We have been seeing refugees, but now it is getting to unprecedented scales. Now, essentially, the government of Nigeria, I think for two reasons. One, they consider people from the border areas in the English-speaking as blood relatives. Some of them are really blood relatives, but also because of the history that there is a disputed land that actually went up to the United Nations, and it was really contested, and so it's a sensitive issue, and therefore the government is trying to be to play this with sensitivity. So, but generally, Nigerian government has granted them recognition. The refugees that are in here, they have been given temporary status. They have been given identity cards, which means they are free to move about. They are allowed to use schools, so their children can go to schools. They can also attend hospitals around the government-owned hospitals and so forth. But majority of them actually are living not in camps, but rather in host communities. So out of the 30,000, for instance, about only 10,000 are living in camps. The vast majority are living in the host, with the host families. And of course, we do know that the hosts are like their relatives, but certainly these are poor agricultural communities that can easily be affected by any little stretch on their livelihood. So that is the situation they are living in currently.
Thank you. And so this program, what is the problem? I know that we can't solve the immigration or migration crisis, but what is this program working towards solving?
So essentially, we all know that UNHCR tries to respond to the needs of the refugees. But if we go back, we will realize that in most times, they are more concerned about shelter, giving them food to eat, and their immediate needs. And when I had discussion with them before this project came in, I realized that they had a concern about this temporary way of dealing with refugees, especially in situations where refugees have a tendency to stay longer. So they approached us and said, we are thinking of how to deal with refugee situations in ways that can be more sustainable in terms of their livelihoods. And then when we explained the ULEAD project, that it builds actually skills and that provides some durable business knowledge to the people, that was very interesting to them. So we have this common need to provide sustainable livelihoods to the refugees. Now, about, like I said, 70% of the refugees are living in host families. Their main concern currently is sustainable livelihood for the refugees. Sometimes they go in and go back, but certainly when you have skills, whether they return to Cameroon or they come back again and become refugees, these skills will always be useful to them. So that's what makes this model very, very useful to them. Now, essentially, there are four key outputs we are working against. Now, the first of them is similar to the ULEAD project, creating entrepreneurship spirit in them. So we provide them with entrepreneurship training and basic life skill training. Number two, we provide them vocational training or technical training so that they decide which area they want to operate in and they have the technical knowledge in that. Number three, we provide them some startup funds. And here, UNHCR again doesn't want them to be given grants because again, grants will make them dependent. So we're looking at a creative way of creating village savings and savings and loans models where money can be put there and that this can be rotating and continuous so that UNHCR will not be coming back all the time. And finally, there's a large segment of them who are actually farmers. These people need farmland, they need techniques in farming and so forth, and that's what we are going to be providing them, inputs, negotiation for land, and then and allowing them to gain their own livelihood in their own ways. So that will be the key thrust of the project.
Excellent. And so your vision, your hopes, your dreams, not only for the refugees, migrants that you're supporting, but also for Nigerian communities. What is it that you're looking to do?
Now, the project is really very, very good. First, I mentioned it's very good for the refugees. It helps them create jobs. It provides them with sustainable livelihoods, whether they are in Cameroon or whether they are back in Nigeria. But it also enhances the relationship between the hosts and the refugees. Remembering that these people are at the threshold of poverty, and therefore any strain on their relationship can lead to some serious problems. So that's another advantage they do. Now, ultimately, it improves their self-esteem, self-worth. They don't see themselves as parasites or living on people and so forth. And our component of the project is actually just one component of all the help that is being given to the refugees. The livelihood section actually seems to complement whether it's the health, the education, and so forth. So it provides a holistic support to the refugees, and finally, it reduces the dependency on UNHCR. Now, in terms of the Nigerians, certainly, it also creates employment. 30% of our beneficiaries will be Nigerians. And it also revitalizes the rural economy because after the training, quite often we find that many of them discover certain opportunities that they have never seen before, they've never realized before, and they begin to capitalize on that. And it fosters peace and coexistence between all the parties.
Thank you very, very much, Ebrima, for the work that you and your entire team are doing in wanting, I know this is a very difficult time in people's lives, and the work that you're doing is just incredible. So I want to now move on to Emeric to talk about the new vulnerable population, economic integration of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia.
Hi, thanks, Tina.
So if I can just give a little bit of context as to what UNHCR is saying about the situation. Colombia is currently facing what the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has described as a monumental, a major humanitarian and unprecedented refugee crisis. So Emeric, as someone who is there, local, on the ground, supporting, what is the current migration situation in Colombia?
Well, thanks a lot, Tina, and hi to everybody. Well, I just try to give a context through my lens, which are the lens of a concerned citizen and a development worker. So I hope this is not too general. But yeah, what is happening now is really well put in that quote. I think this is an unprecedented refugee crisis. And as most of you may know, Venezuela is currently facing one of its worst political, social, and economic crises. And millions of Venezuelans are literally flowing into Colombia and other neighboring countries, such as Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador. The Colombian government's efforts to manage the humanitarian emergency at the border in collaboration with international organizations must be praised. And the government has taken a series of legal and administrative measures which are unprecedented. For instance, they have granted special work and residence permits to this population, enabling them to work in the formal economy access basic social and health services, and also access primary and secondary public education for the children. So to date, there are more than 700,000 Venezuelans in Colombia who have already been registered for such work permits or are in the process of receiving it. And that will allow them to work legally in the country and access these basic services. So frankly, Colombia has really opened its arms and frontiers in response to the crisis, but the situation is also critical in many regards. And most of the 3 million Venezuelans who have been compelled to leave their country since 2015 have no immediate plans to go back to Venezuela. Even if the government of Maduro would fall tomorrow, it's estimated that this population would stay for a very long period of time in the country. So that leaves us with the problem of ensuring inclusion of this population within the economy, and ensuring decent economic opportunities is a challenge, a big challenge, as a large proportion of this population is settling in major cities in Colombia where the unemployment is already high. So the response is praised mostly for the government, but something needs to do in the medium and long-term perspective. The civil society, for its part, I think, is widely divided as well. And as it is the case in many other countries, we can see here a lot of xenophobia, a lot of discriminations towards the migrants. Migrants are victims of abuses, discriminations. It's very often that we hear comments such as migrants are stealing our work, migrants are committing crimes. And one would think that because of the closeliness, both geographical, social, and cultural between Venezuela and Colombia, the process of integration would be sort of easier, but that's definitely not the case. And there is a big rise in discrimination and racism against this population. So the civil society is really divided. And it is true that if you look at the situation of Colombia, the Venezuelan crisis or the migrant crisis adds up to an already complicated situation. Colombia is in the middle of a shaky peace process. Colombia still has to deal with 5 armed conflicts and 5 different armed conflicts between the governments and armed groups. And at the same time, Colombia also have seen a rise in the unemployment over the last few months. So it's logical, and I think in any country in the world where migrants came and the economy is not that good, it's always easy to throw the stone at the migrants and to actually blame the migrants for all the problems of the country. And that's something that is happening right now in Colombia. And finally, what we can see from the private sector is that there is a lack of knowledge basically regarding how they can work with migrants, how they can contract migrants. They also have a lot of prejudices. So there is a big change in the mindset that is needed to actually make it a possibility for migrants to land jobs in the formal sector economy. So if you look at the situation, and in conclusion, I would say that you have all of the elements for the situation to work, meaning that the migrants can open a bank account, migrants have a legal situation, have a legal status, they can benefit from social and health protection and so on. At the same time, they face numerous barriers, both internal and external, that makes it really hard for them to land a proper job, and they are victims of abuses, they are victims of human trafficking, they are victims of labor discriminations and so on. So taking the situation from there, we've actually identified that through the SCOPE project, that is a project which is running for 4 years now in Colombia, we could do something for migrants. So just in a nutshell, the SCOPE project is a project funded by Global FS Canada, who has been running for 4 years now. And it's an inclusive employment project, which means what we are looking at is generating income generation opportunities, either through micro-entrepreneurship or through formal employment for vulnerable populations. So our target groups and our beneficiaries are mainly women, youth, and victims of the armed conflict in Colombia. And what we intend to do is unemployment programs, to put it this way. But at the same time, it's not an employment program in its classic ways. We look at the inclusive employment equation as a threefold sandwich, sort of. On the first hand, we work directly with the beneficiaries, providing them with soft skill trainings, with technical trainings, providing them with the tools to actually access the labor market more easily, So we are working directly with the population. On the other hand, we are also working with the private sector. So what we identify is that we can provide a beneficiary with all the necessary skills in the world, but if you don't change the mindset of the private sector, so they see in this population an added value for the functioning of their companies, then you are missing an element. So what we're trying is to get the private sector on board. We are training the private sector, providing them with technical assistance, so they can actually implement some human resources practices that are more gender inclusive and generally more inclusive of this population. So that's the second part of the equation. And finally, we are also working with the public sector. So we are also trying to help and bring support to the local governments so they can actually design public policies in the long term and in the medium term that actually allow for an enabling environment and for programs and policies that allows inclusion of this population in the programs. We've been doing that for the last 4 years with a specific methodology in mind. What we do is that we look at the beneficiaries and we look at the specific barriers that the beneficiary has to access the labor market. So what we've identified, for instance, is that a lot of beneficiaries don't have the necessary experience or never actually work in the private sector. So when they first enter into the labor market, there is a shock between what they were used to do in the informal economy and what they are going to be required in the private sector. So we've built a methodology that actually brings support to the employees once they have landed the contract, so they have the soft skills and the life skills that allow them to sustain their job. So we are always working with individuals, we're not working with targets, and this is what we've been doing for the last 4 years. As I said, seeing the situation of the migrants, we entered into a discussion with Global Office Canada as whether we should include some new population, a new vulnerable population, within the targets of the projects. So the discussion was held and the decision was made that we should do pilot initiatives to actually generate some economic opportunities for this population. In a nutshell, we have two big specific outcomes. On the one hand, what we want to do with these pilot initiatives is generate the job placements and sustainability of the placement for a total of 400 new beneficiaries. We are working not only with Venezuelan migrants, but we are working with Venezuelan migrants, returned Colombians, and also host communities. Why are we doing that? Because we basically don't want to generate more xenophobia, and we don't want people to say, look at these guys from Cuso, they are working with Venezuelan where the unemployment rates in Colombia is already very high. So what we're doing is always making mixed groups where 50% of the people we are training and placing are Venezuelan and 50% are Colombian in a highly vulnerable population. To date, we have generated 30 placements, and we hope, as I said, to generate about 400 by the end of March 2020. And that's the big main outcome that we are looking at within this project. But at the same time, as I said, what we want to do is to change the mindset. And what we've identified is that we need to actually go to the private sector, speak to the private sector, and bring support to the private sector so they actually see the added value of contracting migrants and vulnerable population. In this sense, what we do is basically telling the company, helping the company to understand what is the legal and administrative procedures to get to contract these migrants within the staff. We are building them with sensitization with regard to xenophobia, with communication campaigns. So basically the human resources policy can become more inclusive and the workplace more migrant friendly. So the second specific outcome is to actually generate that articulation with the private sector in order to make it a process that is sustainable. And finally, our methodology is fast-tracked, which means that we're not doing a long technical training process and by the end of the technical training starting to search for job opportunities. We are doing the other way. First, we are looking at the job opportunities. We are speaking with the companies, securing the vacancies. So we are absolutely sure that the people we are going to train are going to have an economic opportunity at the end, and we don't generate expectation that we can't, that we can deliver. And second, we're just providing the right amount of technical training. So a lot of companies would say, look, the technical training don't look at it. I will take care of it. What I do need is someone that has a lot of life skills, that have a lot of communication skills, that is able to quickly integrate within the team. So what we are doing is a very specific coaching, so these people can directly enter into the job market. And the last concern is that with migrants, in many cases, this population cannot wait for 2 or 3 months of training to get incomes. So you're looking at a population that looks daily for subsistence, that look daily for an amount of money that allow them to eat. So we've identified that we also need to bring a small cash-based assistance to the population once they sign the contract, because they are going to sign a contract and then they're going to spend 2 weeks without any sort of financial resources. So what we do is closing that barrier, and at the day of signing of contract, we actually give them with cash so they can afford transportation and food during the first 2 weeks during which they won't receive money. We have a lot of different tools, let's say, to make it sustainable, but our objective is not only the job placement, but rather that migrants actually sustain their jobs and are able to sustain their job for a minimum of 3 months and construct a life project. So really, as our methodology is not to replace what the public employment services are doing in Colombia, but rather to play with interinstitutional coordination. So there are employment agents in Colombia that are doing the profiling of the migrants on the one hand, and there are on the other hand some public agencies that are doing the match with the offers on the labor market. So we just play as a facilitator, closing bridge for it to make it a match. So that's a bit our methodology, and this is what we are looking at in this scope extension.
Thank you, Emeric. That's incredible. One of the key things that you said was it's not just a number, it's not just a target, that these are people's lives. So can you just talk about kind of the outcome of what you're expecting this program to do for people?
Yeah. So, well, I think, and everybody would agree, I think that jobs and incomes are the foundations for any life project. So if you are providing migrants with economic opportunities, you are actually making it possible for them and their family to reconstruct a life project. And we are speaking about people who have tremendous situation. We have left the countries with absolutely no papers. We don't have any sort of family support in Colombia. And the first steps, if you want these people to actually integrate within the society, is to actually provide them with economic opportunities. So I think at the core of our intervention is giving them the tools to actually rebuild a new life. And if really by the end of the project, we can say that we have landed a job to 400 beneficiaries and offer the chances to 400 families to actually sustain a life in Colombia and sustain decent living conditions, I would say that our mission is accomplished. So really what we're looking at is changing their lives. And at the same time, on the other hand, I think that we want to change minds. Not long ago, yesterday, I was reading an article explaining and demonstrating with macroeconomic indicators that asylum seekers and refugees in Europe are not a burden for European countries, and that at the contrary, if the correct measures are implemented, they can contribute to the economic growth and to the social development of the country. So I think our mission is also to make understand to everybody in Colombia and to all the stakeholders that if the migrants get a job or if migrants are successful integrated within the society, everyone wins. The society wins and the migrants win. So that's a bit what we're looking at.
Absolutely. The work that you and your scope team is doing in peace building for Venezuelan migrants is something to be applauded, and we look forward to coming back in a future webinar to better understand some of those outcomes. So now I would like to bring Ebrima back and have you talk about a little bit your reflections on the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm not going to get too deep into all the 169 targets of the SDGs, but suffice to say that they're a blueprint to achieving a better and more sustainable future for all. It's a global consortium that is addressing not only this migrant issue that we're talking about today, but also any issues in relation to poverty and inequality. So let's start with Ebrima. I heard you talk a lot about all the different partners and collaborations that are happening within your programming. So can you maybe elaborate a little bit on SDG number 17, which stands for partnerships, and why encompass a partnership framework within your programming?
Thank you very much. Actually, I understand SDG 17 as partnerships for all the goals. It's not specifically for one specific goal. And what that means actually is the fact that the goals build on each other and there is no strong dividing line between one goal and another goal. And the full implication of that is whatever work we do to address a single goal, there will be need to really look at the other things that are happening around you. And for that matter, really coming back to this project, the refugee project, UNHCR seems to understand this. They don't work with one partner. Now, essentially, there are diverse, different sectors that they try to address for the refugees. For instance, their protection need, their livelihood, their shelter, their education, their health needs, and so forth. So when you work with them, you work with UNHCR bilaterally, but all these partners meet every month, at least to look to discuss together and bring about their understanding of what the other sector is doing and how we can also improve that. So essentially, moving together seems to be the right way in addressing complex issues, and definitely is the right way to go. Now, different forms of partnerships actually are created in our work, and this is broadly including what we are doing mainly in Cuso International. We do build strategic partnerships where we start from the beginning to the end with specific partners. Sometimes it is we work with implementing partners who we bring on board because of their specific expertise to do certain components and so forth. And our partnerships also span really across even continents. Cuso, if you go back to our history, you will find that we started as a volunteer sending organization, meaning, bringing complementary expertise anywhere in this world to solve development problems. So essentially, we have a lot of experience in that, and that model, in fact, has evolved. Instead of just sending from developed world to developing world, we have looked at models like sending from developing country to another developing country, or diaspora, people coming back to their roots, and they're doing that. So different models of partnerships actually exist. And in Nigeria, where there is an opportunity really to work with national partners as well, we have built on this model as well. So every year, for instance, we work with about 50 to 60 national volunteers. These are supported to develop their professionalism, but also they do quite a lot of good work on our project. But if you look at it broadly, you will realize that there are several benefits to partnerships. For instance, as a Western registered organization, it probably doesn't tell well. You come from the West and you want to do something in your own way in another person's country. So naturally, the opportunity to show respect to indigenous knowledge is demonstrated through partnership. If you work with them, you show that respect to them. There is always an opportunity to innovate. Now, as much as you may know, if you start working with local people and other people, you are going to learn as well. And what that can bring is actually new innovations, putting together the learnings and the growing as a whole, not only an organization, but all practitioners in the sector. This is also what promotes globalization, certainly. When you bring complementary expertise from all over the globe and so forth. Now, there is also situations where naturally what you're doing is just favorable to partnership. You cannot do otherwise. For instance, you can have all the skills and teach people in how poultry is done, for instance, but you gain something extra if you attach that person to a partner who already has a poultry farm. So sometimes when we do trainings, it goes along with some level of attachment to some expertise, and therefore the partnerships continue to grow like that. And I think that's the way we can actually address the global goals of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Absolutely. So it sounds like bringing partners together helps to accelerate the progress of our programs. So thank you for that. And now I'd like to bring Emery back as well, and to have Emery talk about gender and gender-sensitive approach. We know that when we're talking about migration, that gender is at the forefront. So maybe you can share with us a little bit about your gender-sensitive approach within the program.
Yeah, sure. I think, yes, as you rightly said, in any refugee or migrant crisis, women are always at the forefront of the wars that could possibly happen. And they do carry on with her some additional barriers that, that men may not have. So Scope, in general, the project Scope has always had a gender-sensitive approach. Firstly, well, more than 70% of our over 12,000 beneficiaries were women, and a lot of them are single mom, responsible for their whole family. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention. Secondly, I think you need not only to have specific targets saying, okay, we're going to give priority to women, but you actually need to bring on the table specific measures or specific methodology that allow you to treat the specific barriers that women have when it comes to income generation and ensuring their basic human rights. So the project recognized the existence of the specific barriers for women. For instance, women are more likely victims of abuses, of domestic violences, of sexual violence, discriminations. They often lack family support to actually get into the process of economic integration. So the project tries to mitigate some of these specific barriers. So one of the things we've been doing in the past is that we've identified that some women may not keep their job for very long because they do have family issues at home. And when they get to work, they're basically just their head with what is going on home and with their son and daughters at home. So we've identified that in some cases, some ways we could actually resolve this barrier is actually by providing our beneficiaries with psychosocial support, to see if by providing them this clinical psychosocial support, they could increase their chance to retain their job and to remain in the job for a longer period of time. So that's one of the ways we are trying to mitigate these specific barriers that women have. Another thing we've been doing is that we are working directly with the company, as I said before. So also what we think is that we should also convince the company, or better not convince, but bring the tools to the company so they can also become more gender inclusive in their human resources policies. So we've been building a very innovative training routes that we bring for free to private sector companies, where we actually teach the company on how they can improve or review their recruitment processes, how they can improve the communication to make it more inclusive and gender-friendly within the company. We've been bringing all this kind of training to the company so the workplace become more gender inclusive at the very end of the project. And finally, we want to recognize as well that especially Venezuelan migrants, women migrants, they are really likely to also fall under prostitution and other trafficking networks where their health and life is at risk. So that's also something we are taking into consideration. And during year 5 of this project, we will also try to work with this specific group of population by providing income generation for an association of victims of sexual violence. So that's something we've been thinking about, and that we always keep in mind whatever we're doing, that whatever you are doing in development, you should bear in mind that you need a differentiated methodology because the needs and the conditions are different.
Thank you. Absolutely. So thank you, Emeric and Ebrima, for your commitment and your knowledge sharing. As many of you as possible, I want you to be able to get your questions answered. So this is going to be the question and answer period. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a Q&A tab. So let me just open that up and I will field your questions accordingly to the panelists. So just to let the panelists know that you're unmuted. So the first question, so this is for both of you, and just read it. My question is for both panelists. Are these refugees to be settled to Canada or any other third-party country? And how does the skills from the training, how will that help them in their resettlement? So I know that the programming that we're speaking about is in reference to Colombia and Nigeria specifically. So the answer is no to that part, as it asks if they'll be resettled to Canada. But maybe you might know, because I know I saw recently a Colombia, Canada post that was in relation, I believe, to job creation. Is there any discussion around resettlement for migrants to Canada from Colombia or Venezuela that you know of, Emeric?
No, not that I know of, no.
Okay. And Ebrima, likewise, there's no discussion of resettlement of of Cameroonians to Canada?
I don't think it's even feasible. So that's not on the table at all.
Okay. So thank you for that question. I'm going to move on. The circumstances, okay, so they're talking about the Caribbean and how in Trinidad and Tobago there is issues as well. They're asking us what means are being provided. So that is probably a question that's outside of the scope for Cuso International, just because we are not working in those countries, just based on our capacity right now. But thank you, Jules, for that question. And hopefully Global Affairs Canada can support you in getting an answer. So this is definitely in direct question in reference to Cameroon. So it says, hi everyone, I'm Nasir from Cameroon. I appreciate what the Colombian government is doing for Venezuelan refugees, but till when will they be able to support the influx of the population? Why can't Venezuelan neighboring countries put resources together for Venezuela to withstand this migration crisis? So that is directed to Emeric for sure.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I don't think I'm able to answer on the political side. I think how the crisis is coordinated between the nations is something that is really out of my control or my knowledge. Nevertheless, I think the question is very valid to actually know what are the limits in terms of absorption capacity or integration capacity that Colombia has. I do think that the question is valid, but at the same time, I don't think there are many options on the table. So the Colombian government has decided to basically open its borders completely and to receive whoever needs refuge in Colombia. And I think it's really praiseworthy. But obviously, this influx is not going to stop tomorrow. It's not going to stop the next day, and it's going to continue. And it is true that it does generate some tension on the healthcare system. It does generate some tension on the primary education system, and it does generate some tension on the employment market. So up till what point is it sustainable? I do think we've already reached a point where the situation is not sustainable, but at the same time, there is no mean to stop the crisis. The only mean would be to close the frontier. And I don't think that's a position that is humanly acceptable, and that is a position that is in the plan of the government. So I think to some extent, Colombia will need to deal with it, and that's a matter of fact that if we don't put into practices long-term measures to ensure the integration of these migrants, the situation is going to be soon out of control. So that's a very good question. And as for the coordination, I think at least in Colombia, there is a big coordination of all international organizations, just like it happens in Nigeria. Here we do have a lot of coordination tables between ACNUR, between the HCR, between the International Organization for Migration, between the government, between all the actors, so efforts are coordinated. And I think this is also something that must be highlighted in the good aspects of how this crisis is managed.
Thank you. And so just moving on, we do have a few more questions to get through. This is from Jafar. Incredible program, touches my heart. Thank you, Jafar. Just lost. Okay. When one looks at the complexity of the situation, such as the camps in the northeast part of the country, and she's talking about Nigeria, where you see both refugees and internally displaced persons in the same camp, the question is, will our program, Ebrima, be expanding to the north?
If it is to the north of the country, where the security situation is very high, I don't see Cuso going in there in the very near future. But certainly we are looking at the situation on the ground. We are following it closely, and we are in very close partnership with UNHCR to determine where our added value will be needed, and certainly we will be following that and providing as much as we can. And of course, you also know that this the amount of work we can do depends on not only internal factors, but how much money can we generate, how many supporters do we have, and how can we grow, will determine how we can grow our programs.
Thank you. So moving along, there's a question to you, Emeric. I would like to know in which cities Cuso is developing these projects helping Venezuelans.
Yeah, so we're going to do it, we are doing it actually already in 4 major cities in Colombia. We're working in Bogota, we're working in Cali, we're working in Medellin, and we're working in Barranquilla on the Caribbean coast.
Thank you. So there's a few questions in relation to Cuso's international volunteer programs. If you can reach out to me offline and I'll give you that contact information, I'll be happy to support you in finding the right placement for you. So moving along is relations to the immigration topic that we're talking about today. Hello, everyone. I want to know if host communities in Cross River State are willing to accept the immigrants to do business. Will there be funds to support them to establish businesses? And so that's for you, Ebrima.
Yeah, certainly, like I mentioned, the host communities at this point are not hostile to the refugees. Now, they trace some form of relationship with them, they have accepted them, and we hope that will continue up to the extent that their livelihoods are really threatened. So we don't want to get to that point. Now, our project actually is trying to provide that comprehensive support. So it's not only building their skills, but also trying to provide some startup capital for them to start business. And we will try to expand that reach even beyond the UNHCR project. Cuso in Nigeria is trying to expand its funding base so that we can reach out to more people. I think it's as a result of the good work we did in the other places that we are moving here. So if we can do more in any other place where refugees are, we are quite open to do that.
Thank you. So there's quite a few questions in relation to national volunteering and different kinds of volunteer opportunities that I think is outside the scope. So we will take those offline, but I do thank you for your great questions, your engagement. This is a very devoted audience, but we do have to wrap up. And if you would like to continue to make a difference, I really invite you to subscribe to our newsletter, to follow us on social media, visit our website, and become a donor. Your contribution does support refugee programs, and it also supports to mobilize volunteers as agents of change. Our website is www.cusointernational.org. And so I would like to thank our panelists. Without them, I was just the facilitator. Without them, this webinar would not have happened. Thank you to Ebrima and Emeric and our audience for your solidarity. I hope that this interaction has led you to an understanding of our approach of working alongside courageous refugees and migrants in Nigeria and Colombia, and how just part of the solution is helping to build economic independence. So please stay connected for future webinars, and in solidarity, bye for now.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.